my pleasure to introduce Philip M. Carter, who's going to introduce in turn Andrew. And Philip is Associate Professor of Linguistics at FIU. Professor, you've been promoted. I'm sorry, I was looking at the wrong website. Yeah.
All right.
Woo!
My apologies. He's a professor of linguistics and also director of FIU Center for the Humanities in an Urban Environment. Philip is a sociolinguist and scholar of language and culture, focusing primarily on U.S. Latino communities. He works interdisciplinarily, moving between quantitative and qualitative approaches to sociolinguistics, critical discourse analysis, ethnography, and critical theory. His scholarship addresses a range of issues of contemporary concern, including the relationship between social formations and linguistic variation, Spanish language change in the U.S., maintenance and shift of Spanish in the U.S., and popular discourses about language. Philip is the author with Julie Tetzel Anderson of Languages in the World, How History, Culture, and Politics Shape Language. That's Wiley Blackwell, 2015. He's also the author or co-author of many book chapters and papers in leading international journals. Through his scholarship, Philip has also brought attention to the language communities he studies through national and international media. A noteworthy and very recent example of this is his work focusing on Miami English as a distinctive bilingual situation that merits consideration as a regional dialect of American English. And many of you guys probably saw his work highlighted in the New York Times or The Guardian or National Public Radio or any of a number of other news outlets. He's collaborated with Andrew Lynch on a variety of projects, and we'll be introducing him now. Thank you, Philip.
Can I just see by a show of hands who here is not an academic? Anybody not a professor? Gosh, sorry you have to sit through all these introductions. This is how we do it in the academy. They gave me 5 minutes. It's going to take me exactly 6.5 minutes to do this introduction. When I moved to Miami 12 years ago for the position I took and still hold at FIU, I remember making a list of all the things. Man, is that you?
No, that's fine.
No, that's okay. No worries. I remember making a list of all the things I needed to do to learn about the new city and get a program of research started here. At the top of my list was meet Andrew Lynch. Okay? Back then I didn't know Andrew in person, but even a decade ago he was already an important figure in the various fields in which he moved and published, and he was also one of the very few people to be writing about the complexities of language in Miami, and in particular about the ways in which the twin forces of politics and ideology intermingled in ways that shaped language here, often unexpectedly. The publication of his 2009 paper, A Sociolinguistic Analysis of the Final S in Miami Cuban Spanish, cemented Andrew's reputation not only as an important empiricist who could handle the complexities of collecting and analyzing linguistic data in bilingual communities, but also as a key thinker who could both use and challenge the conventional wisdom put forth by linguistic theory. Let me briefly explain. The theoretical architecture of contact linguistics suggests that what we call linguistic changes in progress, things that are happening, as you're living them, such as the lenition or softening of the final S in many varieties of Spanish in the so-called coastal regions, gets catalyzed by contact with another language, in this case English in the context of the United States. We should thus expect to find an acceleration of S weakening among Cuban Americans, whose Spanish is both already always in contact with English, but also circumstanced by the S deleting varieties that came to South Florida with the Marielitos and the Balseros and those in their wake. But rather than taking that topic for granted, Andrew studied it, and upon finding the unexpected, wrote not that linguistic theory was wrong as such, but that it needed an adjustment, namely that the forces of language change must be theorized in the context of the pressures of politics as they get articulated in local settings. Thus, Cuban Americans were suddenly full of S, young Cuban Americans anyways, and it wasn't because they were anomalous to linguistic theory. Instead, Andrew showed us young Cuban Americans were aware of the social meaning that S-lessness conveys, and by deploying a subtly different variant, they were able to position themselves among the classed and racialized waves of immigration from Cuba to have unfolded in ideologically laden ways over the years in South Florida. This paper is now a classic in the study of bilingualism and the study of Spanish in the US. So naturally, this is a person I wanted to meet when I got here. And sometime in the fall of 2011, we found a time to get together for dinner in Coconut Grove. I remember us talking about the discipline, about Chomsky, about variationist linguistics, and about interdisciplinarity. Sorry for these annoying academic words. We saw eye to eye on everything, but we mostly talked about Miami and Spanish in Miami. And in this context, I was very much the student and Andrew was very much the expert. He mentioned that he had started working on a book, a project that to me sounded refreshing and outside of the box. Not the kind of book that we often get from linguists, if I'm honest. The bill came, the dinner ended, but the conversation never really did. Andrew and I have been talking ever since about ever more varied topics, and along the way we occasionally collaborated on research projects, occasionally co-mentoring students, and so forth. So many of my own scholarly observations are the result of conversations I originally had with Andrew. For his watchful eye and ear for nuance have been plugged into the linguistic scene of Miami and its relationship to sociality for more than 2 decades. And here I'll say all that stuff in the New York Times, the calcs of Miami English, Andrew turned me onto that. The years went by as they do, and the conversation carried forth, occasionally punctuated with updates about his book. And as the years went by, Andrew's presence grew across the many subfields of the discipline in which he works, publishing on topics as varied as discourses about Fidel in Miami, the history of Spanish as a heritage language in the US, the diffusion of English origin lexical items in Miami Cuban Spanish, the status of Miami as a southern city, the status of Miami as a global city, mass media and Spanish in Miami, Spanish in the workplace, etc., inter alia. So here we are in the present, and since that dinner 12 years ago, and since that first mention of, Nan, I'm starting a new book project, Andrew has published many dozens of articles and chapters, received thousands of citations to his work, and is now one of the most sought-after public speakers in the fields allied to the study of Spanish in the US. As the aphorism goes, good things come to those who wait, and nothing could be more true of this important book, which he has entitled Spanish in Miami, Sociolinguistic Dimensions of Postmodernity. This book, which is as beautiful in its style of writing as it is in its abundant and trenchant examination of its objects of analysis, will redefine how we study bilingualism in social contexts. Let me just give you a quick example of how Andrew thinks and writes in this book by quoting a couple of lines from the preface. He says, "How does one explain that Spanish is lost, yet at the same time spoken among successive generations in Miami? How to affirm that the language is marginalized in a city where the majority of the people across all socioeconomic strata are actively speaking it? Spanish in Miami is both local and transnational without being national. It is accorded great prestige, and yet it is stigmatized. It is the immigrant in-group cultural code of wealth, but also of poverty. It is now spoken by more people than ever before in the city's history, and yet its use evokes nostalgia. It can be characterized as a heritage language, yet it represents the city's future arguably just as much as English." Those are his words. The subsequent 300 or so pages gives us a framework for understanding this paradox through a very detailed account of language in modernity first and post-modernity second, overlain on the places, people, histories, and stories of Miami. It is quite simply the smartest thing I have read in a very long time. So it is my great pleasure to introduce my colleague, my dear friend, and as I say, my academic brother, Andrew Lynch.
Thanks to all of you for coming. It's a really busy start of the academic year, and thank you, Philip, for that really kind and generous introduction. Among many things that Philip and I have in common besides our intellectual interest in language, is everyone hearing me okay?
Yeah.
I always got in trouble in school for talking, so it shouldn't be an issue. But things we have in common beyond an intellectual interest in language and our respective research agendas on bilingualism in Miami is there's also the fact that we're both from North Carolina. And I don't know how Philip feels, but from time to time, my inner self still sort of feels like the boy from the Blue Ridge Mountains up near Asheville. So I have to admit that it's a little surreal for me to be standing here today presenting a book about Spanish in Miami. It took me a long time to get here. There was a lot of ground to cover in all senses of the word. And I had a lot to learn, including the Spanish language. But I feel like the main reason that it took me so long to get here actually had more to do with Miami than it did with me personally. And so I was going to begin by just reading a part from the preface that Philip gratefully already read part of. And that starts out by saying that while observing and studying Spanish in Miami, I've many times felt like the ethnographer in Borges' celebrated short story, who ultimately chose not to write anything because he realized the unrelatability of what he had learned in the field. So some of you know the ethnographer by Jorge Luis Borges, you know that. And then come all those questions that Philip posed. And I said that struggling to explain this reality, even if only to myself, I took some solace in critical cultural theory, which uniformly asserts that irony, paradox, contradiction, and enigma are part and parcel of what's called the postmodern condition. And I know some people view that as a hokey term, but I'm using it in the sense of mapping ideas here. So the premier postmodern city of the Americas, as Jan Niemann convincingly argued in a 2011 book, I think Miami should be expected to present with all of these troubling traits, that is, troubling at least from an objective social scientific perspective. If you like to think of linguistics as something scientific, I don't necessarily, but a lot of people affirm that. And so what began in the late 1990s as my modest effort to document the situation of Miami Cuban Spanish in a sort of classic sociolinguistic sociology of language fashion, morphed into something motivated more by cultural theory and the emergent field of language ideology toward the late 90s. And so as I began to see Miami through those lenses, I think I just gradually gave up on describing the situation of Spanish in Miami from a canonical, variationist, or language sociological perspective. And I gave up not because I considered either of those possible perspectives inadequate or undue, but because I realized that for me, at least, the narrative voice most suited to relating the sociolinguistic marvel of Spanish-speaking Miami was probably of a different timbre. That's that particular part of the preface. So across the 6 chapters of the book, and I apologize, we don't have the visual here. So,
I apologize, Andrew.
So you're stuck with me and this voice, okay? And I'll do my best to keep this as engaging as possible without you having the visual support there. But there are 6 chapters of the book, and the proposals, for each of the 6 chapters, proposals of various prominent theorists from the fields of cultural studies, media studies, anthropology, philosophy, and sociolinguistics provide the framework for analysis and discussion of the studies that are presented. And those studies are based principally on surveys and interviews that I've conducted with hundreds of people. I've not done a tally, but hundreds, maybe close to 1,000, I don't know, in Miami over the past, 25 years now. I first started this in 1998. Chapter 2, which is about the cultural imaginary and the mediatization of Spanish in Miami, and Chapter 2 is titled Imagining Spanish in Miami, relies upon methodological proposals in the field of critical discourse analysis. So I'll tell you a little bit about the book selectively, and I begin with the last chapter, which is Chapter 6, and the title of that chapter is Beyond Miami. In his widely cited book, The Repeating Island, Antonio Rojo affirmed that within the socio-cultural fluidity that the Caribbean archipelago presents, and I quote him, within its historiographic turbulence and its ethnological and linguistic clamor, one can sense the features of an island that repeats itself, unfolding and bifurcating until it reaches all the seas and lands of the earth. End of the quote. Benita Rojo conceptualized the Caribbean historically and culturally as an island bridge that connects North and South America in another way, in his terms, a sort of meta archipelago. And he said that the Caribbean is constantly emanating outward in a continual flow of paradoxes that are nonlinear, fractal, and iterative. And he says, I quote him, "I've emphasized the word repeats because I want to give the term the almost paradoxical sense with which it appears in the discourse of chaos, where every repetition is a practice that necessarily entails a difference and a step toward nothingness." Which one, then, would be the repeating island? Jamaica, Aruba, Puerto Rico, Miami, Haiti, Recife? Certainly none of the ones that we know. quote. So chaos doesn't imply the absence of regularities or patterns in scientific complexity theory. On the contrary, it refers to a condition or state within which iterative patterns and feedback loops emerge to reveal complex systems that are characterized chiefly by instability and flux. In complex systems, the boundary is unclear even after it has emerged. So in his influential work on complexity theory and philosophy and science, Paul Céliès affirmed in 2016 that the boundary is neither purely a function of our description, nor is it a purely natural thing. We can never be sure that we found or defined it clearly, and therefore the closure of the system is not something that can be described objectively. An overemphasis on closure will also lead to an understanding of the system that may underplay the role of the environment. End of quote. Now, I think that environment seems the most crucial element of any account of Spanish in the United States. To date, our understanding has generally relied, at least in social sciences and linguistics, has generally relied upon static, linear models of language that emphasize the cross-generational dimension of language acquisition and use. And within those models, processes of so-called incomplete acquisition and grammatical simplification in US-born generations result from reduced input in the language and use of Spanish, reduced input of the use of Spanish among those who were born here in the US. And so emerges an intergenerational portrait of a seemingly futureless or ephemeral language. And so in retrospect, studies of language shift that were published, because we say shift happens. Studies of language shift published during the 70s and the 80s in the US could have in no way anticipated the demographic, economic, mediatic boom of Spanish that was going to occur in the 1990s. And if you're closer to my age, you know what I'm talking about. From a societal perspective, Spanish has become more present than ever since the 1970s and 80s, despite cross-generational discontinuity. And it's garnered a remarkable degree of public legitimacy in mass media, commerce, political debate, the discourse of consumerism. I'd say that what the remarkable expansion of Spanish in the US since the 80s demonstrates is that the continuity of Spanish in this country is non-linear. Non-linearity, are y'all bored? Again, I apologize that you don't have all this. I had points up there so you could follow. I know this is a bit much.
I can add that for you.
In mimers, yeah. Non-linearity is a defining feature of what's called a complex system, meaning that relatively small changes to initial conditions can ultimately have large effects overall. One example is the pattern of growth and collapse of cyclonic storms. We're always watching those this time of year. There's one out there right now. If you've not heard, just look at the Weather Channel. These systems reflect non-equilibrium in stages of sustenance and then dissipation of energy once a tipping point is reached, as in the case of an economic collapse that no one saw coming, or political revolts where everything is turned on its head, or the psychology of crowd dynamics, when a crowd gets crazy and everyone, there's a stampede and no one figures how all of a sudden it happened and then the energy dissipates all of a sudden, right? So this is what's called chaos, right? Growth, sustenance, and then collapse occur in a chaotic nature. So hurricanes, in fact, illustrate one of the many sorts of unforeseeable factors that may shape the situation of Spanish language in the US. Case in point, the sociolinguistic impact of some, and the estimate is rough, 280,000 displaced Puerto Ricans who arrived in Florida following Hurricane Maria in 2017. What model of sociolinguistic discontinuity could have possibly anticipated that storm and its consequences? Similarly, who in 1959, upon Fidel Castro's rise to power, could have imagined the numbers of Cubans arriving in Miami still to the present day? Who in 1979 could have predicted the sociolinguistic effects of the Sandinistas' overthrow of Anastasio Somoza's regime in Nicaragua? Or the profound societal instability caused by the FARC in Colombia, or the Shining Path in Peru in the 1980s, or the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, which would have ripple effects in Cuba, subsequently driving massive numbers of balseros to Miami by the mid-1990s, or the support that Hugo Chavez would garner in Venezuela by the late 1990s, or the collapse of the Argentine banking system in 2001, etc. All these events, like so many others on a smaller scale, sent hundreds of thousands of migrants here to Miami, constantly renewing the vitality of Spanish and reshaping the sociolinguistic landscape on a constant, almost everyday basis. That reshaping occurred in tandem with neoliberal economic practices that emerged in the 80s and 90s, Reagan, Thatcher, those years, right? Global investment, Miami's rise as a crucial center for Latin American banking, an immense global Spanish language television industry, Univision, Telemundo, our headquarters, right over here, and for contemporary debates around language and ethnicity, racial identity, and even presidential election outcomes. There was certainly a change in the way that Spanish was imagined in public life in Miami at the end of the century. Spanish transformed from a talking point regarding ethnic identity and cultural assimilation during the 80s, when Miami, yes, I'm sad to say that Miami was at the forefront of the official English fervor that swept the US in the 80s. All those debates started right here in the late 70s and then spread beyond to Miami. To then quickly become enmeshed in the discourse of economic neoliberalism and the so-called global economy by the early 90s. I was going to share with you some headlines from the Miami Herald and then show a slide that features Miami Vice, Scarface, and Dexter. So imagine it. They're actually on my computer, but I don't know who has bionic vision to see that.
Philip's advancing it.
There's all those article headlines. Yeah, just go on to Dexter. Look at that, isn't that
There we
cool?
go.
Yeah. These are the things a friend does for you. Okay. So, chapter 2 of the book, Imagining Spanish in Miami, is organized around two principal metaphors that, as I suggest, the mass media used to construct the ideological place of Spanish in Miami during the final decades of the 20th century. One of those metaphors was battleground, and the other was marketplace. So the battleground is a narrative continuation of the modern national boundary and the struggle to maintain the boundary in ethnic and linguistic terms. So this marks the time of the debates around English only, official English, etc. 20-some states. Before the 80s, there were only 2 or 3 states or something that had an official policy about English. By the end of the 80s, there were some, like 21 or 22. So it was truly a fervor of the sort of panic to establish English as the official language. Because as you know, at the federal level, the US does not have an official language. So the battleground metaphor in Miami has not only been employed to conceptualize and express the social realities of immigration and ideologies of language, as in other parts of the US, but it has in some ways served to create the image of the city itself. And so if you think about, have you all seen Cocaine Cowboys? So right, this display, right, of all the violence that was going on in Miami. It was top of the most murderous city in the country in the early 80s, and it was the drug cartels fighting it out and all these things, right? I explain how, I argue in chapter 2 that metaphor of the battleground was appropriated for discussions of language and arguments about establishing English as the official language and saving all ourselves, in a sense. So the marketplace, right? Yeah, you gotta laugh about this stuff. Okay, so the marketplace metaphor is the prevailing trope of postmodern economic neoliberalism. And I rely on the term postmodern largely in a global economic sense. Okay, I know it's debated a lot in cultural studies and it feels like architecture, but I use it to capture a moment when there's a sort of shift of things because things like mass media show up, the internet shows up, the global economy shows up, and that those phenomena really in an insidious and very important way, begin to change the ways that we think about language and perceive language, especially in terms of boundaries and when and where it's appropriate to use a particular language, etc. So the rise of Spanish in U.S. public life through the marketplace metaphor was not a novel phenomenon within the context of Miami, because there had always been a discussion of the importance of Spanish since the city's incorporation in the late 1830s, because we were very bound up with what was going on in Cuba, yeah, and the back and forth of the economy and politics and all that. So from the perspective of Miami, the neoliberal economic Hispanic marketplace that emerges in the 80s and 90s is just kind of the salient swell of a cultural current that had already characterized the city's foundation. So Miami's economic livelihoods always depended substantially on the commodification of leisure and entertainment. Miami was post-industrial without ever being industrial. We were already a service sector economy before the service sector economy and the tertiarization of the economy started happening within the framework of postmodernity. And so the city really depended upon strategies of image making and marketing that were always necessarily discursive in nature and hence linguistic. So the point of chapter 2 is that the mediatization of Spanish during the last part of the 20th century was both reflecting and serving to establish the legitimate place of Spanish in Miami. And I think nowhere do we see that better than in the late 1970s sitcom, yes, Que Pasa USA? Que Pasa USA. On sociolinguistic grounds, that show transcended the Miami Cuban experience. As you know, it was a bilingual show, fully in Spanish and English. You really had to know both languages to get it and follow along. It was made for a local Miami audience, and surprisingly, it ended up being picked up on like 120-something markets across the U.S. In the late 70s, and it was even seen in some Latin American countries. So it was kind of unexpected, and I think that that show could have only been credible at the time in Miami. Yeah. And in that respect, I believe that Miami was likely the first ideological location for the mediatization of Spanish in the U.S., right? Bilingualism sort of becomes more mainstream through the 90s and the 2000s, etc. Now, the course that ideologies about Spanish and English took in the new Miami, as some people call it, during the 2000s, is the focus of chapter 3, and that chapter is titled "The Postmodern Paradox of Spanish in Miami." That chapter explores the attitudes and perceptions of high school students who were born in the 1990s. In unconscious, but I think also highly conscious ways, Miami Latinx youth have to negotiate identities that are much more complex than those of their monolingual Anglophone counterparts just up to the north. You only have to get as far as what, Fort Lauderdale, Boca, right? Well, beyond Fort Lauderdale, right? Or their monolingual Spanish-speaking counterparts just to the south, across the water. Young Miami Latinos face pressure to assimilate to a monolingual Anglophone mainstream that emanates from national discourse spheres and is institutionally enacted in formal education. I've always said that the educational domain is the only domain or sector in Miami where Spanish remains unabashedly marginalized. Yeah? But that pressure has to be reconciled with an equally intense exigency to speak Spanish, not just in familial and local domains, including the workplace, but also in the macro level discourse of globalization more abstractly. So I would say these are two language ideological dimensions of what I would call a complex vertical scalar order of Spanish in Miami. And I'm kind of pulling here on Jan Blomark for those of you who work in sociolinguistics and sociolinguistics of globalization. So I would say this vertical scalar order reflects a sociolinguistic situation that can be viewed as paradoxical, hence the title of the chapter, The Postmodern Paradox. The local expediency and transnational exigency of Spanish in Miami synchronically contest the diachronic prevalence of English along a cross-generational axis. And this casts Spanish in a sort of contradictory or even precarious position vis-a-vis US nationalism, right? One language, one nation ideology. I would say that's because localism conspires with transnationalism, kind of against nationalism, if you want to think of it in those terms. So in my study, teenagers from wealthy families, so the survey was conducted at a public school in Hialeah, I won't say which, and a very elite private school down in the southern part of the city. I won't say which, obviously, but the families of most students at the private school were multimillionaires, okay? Teenagers from wealthy families in my study were significantly more opposed. Wealthy teenagers were significantly more opposed to the idea that Miami would be a better place if everyone spoke only English. And they disagreed that English is the true language of success in Miami. While their working class counterparts up in Hialeah, on the other hand, appeared pretty much indifferent regarding those two statements. Now, they weren't in favor of them, but the point is they were different, okay? Working class high schoolers also disagreed, less than wealthy ones, with the suggestion to make English the sole official language of the US. So the wealthy kids were more emphatic about, not making English the official language. I'm sorry, the wealthy kids were less emphatic about that. Yet at the same time, both groups equally agreed that Spanish is necessary to be successful in Miami, and the working class students even showed slightly more agreement with the affirmation that Spanish is necessary for a good job in Miami. But meaningful social divisions are drawn between recent arrival immigrants and US-based Miami Latinx students, and those social divisions appear to shape attitudes toward English and Spanish, and that's especially so in lower income areas. And I am going to have this slide because it's going to, and that's because of what's called the REF, R-E-F, phenomenon, and I have that on the slide, so. There's a hurricane. Whoops, I was going backwards rather than forwards. I'm sorry. Okay, so a student, former student, someone I'm interviewing, recalling his high school experiences in previous years, says the refs were ESOL kids, so English is second language. They were maybe bullied sometimes and kind of looked down upon. They were definitely isolated in their own groups. I mean, sometimes a ref, and that's short for refugee, would actually be someone's cousin, or like someone would start dating a ref or whatever. Or there would be sports and refs would be on the teams and all. They'd be in our AP math or science courses because they were super smart, but for the most part, people didn't cross lines. Of course, it wasn't really because we couldn't communicate with them. Like 90% of us spoke Spanish well, and we'd talk to them sometimes, so it was more of a cultural thing. The way they dressed, the way they acted, some of them were obnoxious. They just didn't act like the rest of us. We all spoke English, or mostly English to each other, and they always spoke Spanish to each other. Some of them really struggled with English, others just didn't really try, I think, and so we looked down on them. It wasn't because of their race or where they were from or anything like that. I mean, we were all Cuban or Nicaraguan or Colombian or whatever also. They came from the same place we did. We're all Hispanic, we all speak Spanish, but they don't really speak English. Now, when they had learned English after a couple of years or whatever, most of them, then they had transitioned into being more like everybody else, like normal. Yeah. They weren't always, this is my favorite, they weren't always refs for life. This is a guy who's early 20s who's recalling, right, his high school years just recent. Another guy told me this. I grew up really poor in X neighborhood, I won't say which, with only Spanish-speaking parents and was an ESOL, or English as a second language, in elementary. Whenever I had to get my time restriction for testing, I remember hearing, oh, we just gotta wait for the Refi kids to finish first. When standardized testing would go on. I picked up English quickly and was able to get into gifted classes, and then it became, why are you dressed so Refi, from my classmates. Later, my family moved to the South, meaning south part of Miami, which, as you know, tends to be wealthier than northern parts of Miami. There's that north-south divide. And I went to a magnet school and kind of like switched into my English self. And it's a strict magnet school, so the ref archetype disappeared. And I was only around people who poked fun at the ref. It sucked. Because there's rich kids in private schools here that are Hispanic, and they have only Spanish-speaking parents too, but they're totally saved all this face. So I think there's definitely a there's definitely a socioeconomic thing going on there. So now, all these comments that people had been making to me about the ref phenomenon in Miami, and I interviewed a lot of teachers who confirmed this. This is not just these, this is a thing, right? So ask a few, 13, 14-year-olds, have they heard this term? They'll probably say yes. So with people making these comments about the ref phenomenon in Miami secondary schools, it actually reminded me of my own days as a high school exchange student in West Germany, in a small town very close to the French border, back in 1989. Sorry, just gave my age away. Before the fall of the Berlin Wall. I recall that my classmates in West Germany sometimes made fun of East German migrants. They playfully and pejoratively called them Aussies, denoting someone from the Ost, which is the German prefix for East. Okay. So the inspiration for chapter 4, which is titled Power and Solidarity Across the Miami-Havana Divide, actually came from sociolinguistic studies that I was reading about the division of East and West Germany during World War II. Berliner dialects clearly came to reflect the physical and ideological division of speakers in Berlin by the 1980s. So the wall goes up early 60s. So we're talking 20 years, okay? And that's about the time a team of sociolinguists started to document colloquial variants of Berlinerisch, or Berliner dialect, that were more, what they found is the colloquial variants of Berlinerisch were more frequent in everyday usage in East Berlin, while in middle-class areas of West Berlin, those same variants were stigmatized. People didn't like them or they avoided them. So this group of sociolinguists suggested that in the East, communist ideology had a particular favoring effect on what were considered popular or informal or colloquial ways of speaking at the time of the war, while in West Berlin, according to them, capitalism had entrenched the practice of Standardhochdeutsch, or Standard High German, and they said, in West Berlin, I'm quoting them, in West Berlin, the Berlin dialect is associated with a value system that is vulgar, insolent, proletarian, or uneducated. Now, they're not saying that. This is what people, right, are saying to them. That is virtually non-existent in East Berlin. The orientation to the standard language in West Berlin, as a matter of principle, reflects the relationship between the convertibility of linguistic capital into economic capital, profit, and profit maximization. End of quote. And I had a picture of Fidel and Che Guevara to project for you, so some of you might be grateful that I did that. There they are. So, as Fidel Castro's regime in Havana worked to dismantle the capitalist class-based structure of the Cuban economy during the 1960s, Cubans in Miami set out to establish a free market enclave economy of their own. As sociologists Alejandro Portes and Alex Stepik, in a 1993 book called Miami City on the Edge, which is a great book, by the way, affirmed, Portes and Stepik said, in political defeat, success in business gradually emerged as a source of collective self-esteem and as proof of the correctness of the refugees' ideological stance. While Cuba went down economically, the Miami enclave flourished on the energies of exile entrepreneurs and the social capital created by their solidarity. End of quote. So in this respect, the Miami-Havana divide was not just economic or political, or about the reproduction of Cuba's class system here in South Florida, as sociologists like Guillermo Grenier from FIU have suggested. But it was also about, I think, ultimately proving who was right and who would end up being on the right side of history. Since 1950, and yeah, well, we won't say any more about that, right? Since 1959, Cuban migrants and their US-born children and grandchildren have largely positioned themselves against Castro's communist order of things, placing social classes among Miami Cubans in sharper relief. By the early 80s, time of arrival from Cuba emerged as a central aspect of one's identity as a Miami Cuban. And that's a variable that remains important to the present day. That happened in the early 80s with the arrival of the Marielitos. Although the vast majority of Marielitos were socioeconomically and educationally quite similar to the previous wave of Cuban immigrants in the 70s, and I'm basing that on research conducted by Alejandro Portes, Alex Stepik, a minority element, something about 4 to 6% is what's estimated, had criminal records from Cuba because Castro supposedly opened the prisons and said, you know, all the trash can go to the US if that's where you want to go. But there's really a very small element, but that element was highly publicized. Think now of Scarface and Miami Vice. Yeah, Scarface, 1983. They popularized the stereotype criminality, and there we go back to the mediatization point that I was making earlier. So the tension regarding culture from pre-Mariel, post-Mariel vantage points, I think is indeed reminiscent of the Aussie-Vessie divide that led up to the reification of Germany. Shortly after I finished high school, the wall came down and all that ended. So generally among earlier arrivals and their offspring, a pre-Castro, post-Castro ideological line was drawn based upon the idea that the quality or correctness of Spanish on the island deteriorated under communism. Now I'm not affirming that, I'm telling you what a lot of people have said to me, okay? Although the impression that someone is a good or a bad speaker of any language is a holistic one. And from a sociolinguistic point of view, you know, there's no such thing as correct or incorrect language. All that is ideologically determined, right? Conditioned by what you've been convinced is the correct form versus the incorrect form. So we won't go into that, right? Big hook to swallow, I know, but it's really all just a mind game, okay? Correct language versus incorrect. And so, although the impression is a holistic one, there are particular features of the speech of later arrival Cubans, so in the 80s, 90s, moving forward, that are perceptually salient, like the deletion of syllable final S that Philip mentioned. So rather than las costas de Cuba son bonitas, right, the coasts of Cuba are pretty, you hear something like la costa de Cuba son bonita. So there's no sort of final S, and there's a lot of vowel opening phonologically, for those of you who know something about phonology. So those kinds of traits, along with the syllable final R, so things like rather than puerta, you hear puerta, right? Or el baño, you hear el baño, no? Those phenomena with R are perceptually salient, and they acquired a sort of, they've gone about acquiring a sort of social indexicality, marking who speaks better Cuban Spanish and who doesn't, among a lot of people, not everyone. Gabriela Alfaraz, who's a fellow sociolinguist at Michigan State, and who's actually Cuban-American, has done a number of studies on the R and other features of what's happening with Spanish in Cuba since the 60s. Gabriela Alfaraz affirms this. Established Cubans point to the variety spoken by new arrivals here in Miami, with its abundance of unfamiliar lexical items and perhaps with phonetic and grammatical changes that advanced over the course of 40-some years, and noted a corrupt form of the language they knew. So the linguistic variable that I take up in chapter 5 is actually personal pronoun preference, tú versus usted. Indeed, the usage of du and sie in German took on ideologically charged connotations in East and West Germany. Tudeo, or the use of tú in Spanish, is highly favored on both sides of the Florida Straits, as you know, by a solidarity ethic that actually stemmed from two historically very different ideological milieus, and let me explain that briefly. In Miami, tú reflected, and that's sort of, for those of you who don't know Spanish, like sort of the informal way of addressing a you, right? Tú reflected the confidence and the intimacy of the early exiles who established a successful enclave economy in the setting of US-based capitalism. In Cuba, tú was symbolic of the egalitarian philosophy of comradeship, compañero, compañera, in the context of Soviet-backed communism. And there were a number of studies carried out in countries of the former East Bloc about pronoun usage that presented compelling findings about the way things were going. So my point is, both of these milieus favor the expansion of tú, but for rather different motives. Which one, though, would appear to propel tú farther in the cross-generational sense? So that chapter is based on a lot of survey data and interviews with Cubans of highly diverse origins, generations in Miami, different socioeconomic backgrounds, occupations, levels of education, neighborhoods of the city. And I'm not going to tell you what the study found. For that, you'll have to read chapter 4. I leave you with the drama. What I will go ahead and tell you, though, is that English language ability assumes an important social indexical value that give fluent bilinguals a high degree of social prestige. From the perspective of recently arrived immigrants who know little to no English, Anglicisms in Spanish are actually a relatively good and desirable thing. And this is true of middle and upper class Spanish speakers in the monolingual Spanish speaking world, right? People sort of show off their English language abilities as a way of, right, social indexicality. Look how educated and cosmopolitan I am. So the study that I present in chapter 5, which is called The Boundaries of Anglicisms, reveals a heightened perception of language variability in relation to knowledge and use of English. So the study is based on interviews and surveys from 385 individuals of all social and national linguistic backgrounds, not just Cubans. So this was everybody, as much as I could get everybody. So when it comes to the perception and use of Anglicisms, various sorts of sociolinguistic boundaries in Spanish-speaking Miami come to mind. Boundaries across generations in the US, boundaries of social status. Some people might think Anglicisms are more characteristic of lower class speech. They are referred to level of education and socioeconomic status, reflecting a popular conviction that middle and upper class speakers are more conscientious about language use. One might suppose that the dynamic bilingual context of Miami serves to amplify an already widespread tendency to use Anglicisms among the city's majority of speakers who are from the Caribbean, because you know that in the Caribbean, the influence of English has been extensive for the past 100 years. But as the chapter demonstrates, these intuitive sorts of hypotheses don't align very easily with sociolinguistic reality. That's what I've found out. It's a more complex matter. The effects of variables like linguistic ability in Spanish and English, socioeconomic status, formal education level, depend on the type of Anglicism in question. So loan words, things like mall, centro comercial, the mall, go to the mall, mall, laptop, which is actually integrated in a lot of varieties of Spanish, sort of play out very differently than calques. So something like introducir, when making reference to introducing someone, rather than presentar. Furthermore, different sorts of calques manifest in rather different ways. So one-word calques like introducir, registrar, aplicar, I'm not going to take the time to explain these, ask a bilingual friend, often take on, look, learn Spanish, often take on decidedly different sociolinguistic profiles than syntactic calques like déjame saber, calque in English, let me know, or te llamo para atrás, I'll call you back, or ¿cómo te gustó la película? How did you like the movie? In Spanish, beyond the US would just be te gustó la película, right? Anyway. So for that chapter, I relied actually upon Edouard Glissant's Poetics of Relation to place the analysis in theoretical perspective, arguing that ideological, what he calls transparency versus opacity, drive the social diffusion of Anglicisms here in Spanish-speaking Miami. Glissant's argument was all about the Francophone Caribbean and Creoles vis-a-vis Standard French, but a lot of the things that he said about language ideology, I worked with a Plangton here in Miami, and he actually mentions Miami in that book on one occasion, which I was kind of surprised by. So I'm not using the terms transparency and opacity in a cognitive linguistic sense of form meaning mapping, but rather in an ideological sense of correctness and variability in sociopolitical context. Glissant says this: the only merit to correctness of language lies in what this language says in the world. Even correctness is variable. Ideologically speaking, correctness characterizes the language, with italics by Glissant, a sociopolitical construct, atavistic in nature, made explicit in formal learning, decrees, dictates, that attempt to, in his words, form a dam against what makes languages fragile and thus keep it transparent. So, social status stems from the position that one takes regarding the meaning of correctness. That is, correctness has repercussions not just on the idea that one has of language, but on the idea one forms of the language's relationship with other languages. Hence, the title of his book, Poetics of Relation. So, this concern about the idea that one has about language's relationship with other languages is central to the argument that I make in that chapter. So loanwords appear the most obvious site in this respect, things like mall, ATM, online, these borrowings, if you will, from English. So they're obvious because they're structurally very conspicuous. You know they're English, right? Well, to a certain extent. So, in that regard, the idea that one has about the relation between English and Spanish can be easily mapped onto loanwords. They easily accrue social indexical value. So stated another way, because they stand out so much, loanwords get a lot of attention in terms of the ideas that people have about the sociopolitical relationships between languages. And my study revealed that the perceived acceptability of loanwords was significantly tied to variables of social status. And guess what? It was middle and upper class speakers who were much more likely to consider loanwords acceptable. Although syntactic calques, like te llamo para atrás or como te gustó la película, are ideologically less consequential because they generally go unnoticed by those who don't have high degrees of ability in both languages, or unless their attention has been called to the fact, right? And so in this respect, quite different than loanwords, syntactic calques perhaps deserve more attention than they actually get in the overall ideological scheme of things. And Philip's been working on that in Miami English. And that was, you probably saw a mention of his research in a lot of places that Phil mentioned earlier, New York Times. So I'm very proud of him, my academic brother. So I'll end here. More than 2 decades of observation and personal inquiry in Miami have actually led me to a conclusion similar to that of Argentine journalist and cultural critic Hernan Iglesias Illa. And he published a book titled, in 2010, Miami, la última frontera en América Latina, or la última frontera, colonos y aventureros en la última con la última frontera de América Latina, or something like that. It's a good book. It's funny and it's informative. Anyway, in that book, and he's from Argentina, he says, la convivencia del inglés y el español es un tema apasionante para quienes escribimos sobre Miami. Pero con el tiempo me fui dando cuenta de que no lo es tanto para los miamenses, quienes ven la superposición de idiomas como algo tan normal y práctico que ni siquiera vale la pena prestarle demasiada importancia. So that was the how do you say convivencia? Living together? Coexistence. Thank you, colleagues from modern language. The coexistence of English and Spanish is an exciting or stimulating topic for those of us who write about Miami, but over time I started to realize that it's not so interesting or exciting for Miamenses, for people in Miami, because they see the superposition or overlays and relationships of languages as something so normal and practical that it's not even worthy of paying any attention to it. So, as I affirm in the book, both languages are highly commonplace, and I don't have to tell this audience that, in practically all sectors and settings of the city. Bilingualism is the social norm. And if you don't recognize that, you've had the wool pulled over your eyes, or you're living in a silo somewhere around there. But bilingualism really is the social norm if you move around Miami enough, to such extent that beyond educational settings, that's the big exception, my own expressions of curiosity about bilingual practices have oftentimes been met with puzzlement. ¿Por qué tú quieres saber eso, right? Why is that interesting? So in light of the ubiquity of bilingualism in Miami, one has to constantly wonder how perceptible the boundaries of Spanish and English, or the boundaries of different varieties of Spanish actually are. And we have to wonder how acceptable incursions across boundaries might be. Understanding boundary not as something that separates one thing from another, but rather as something that constitutes that which is bounded. And those are the words from Paul Sier's, from complexity theory. So I believe that this enabling rather than confining role that's played by the perceptual boundary is crucial to an understanding of the present day situation of Spanish, not only in Miami, but in the US and across the Spanish-speaking world more broadly, because Anglicisms are a very real thing in Spain and Colombia and Argentina, Mexico, you name the country. And that's what I've tried to advance in this little book, and I hope you'll find it thought-provoking.
Gracias.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for painting us such a vibrant word picture that made up to a very significant degree for the lack of visuals, for which, again, I apologize. And now I'm trying to get this thing to work. This has been one of those nights. Does this one come out?
It does, yeah. You can take that one out.
Let's do that.
Well, or maybe I can just question.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's pass the mic around. Questions for Andrew? Yes.
So something that you just triggered this sense that among Hispanics in the area, there is this game of recognition or of identifying what version of Spanish you're speaking that depicts where you may be from. What would you say about that particular aspect of the Spanish language?
So like the game of figuring out where someone is from? Is that
or recognizing that you're from the same place because you recognize the dialect or the accent or...
Yeah. So, I guess that's pretty anecdotal. Really the most systematic kind of inquiry that I've done on that is the use of Spanish in mass media, quote-unquote neutral Spanish, en español neutro, which is supposedly used in Telemundo and Univision, although some people from Telemundo have told, so I've interviewed a number of reporters and producers and stuff over the past few years, and people from Telemundo claim that their Spanish is a Spanish that serves to unite, and some people from Telemundo, and I won't say names, have told me that what goes on at Univision is just a reproduction of standard Mexican television Spanish. And so some people say, oh, Univision sounds more Mexican than Telemundo, right? But when you ask people, you hear different things. A lot of reporters at Telemundo have told me that they don't really make any effort to sound Mexican-like. They make an effort to sound standard and use terms that everyone would understand. So rather than, well, this is simple, but rather than guagua, autobus, go down the list of lexical items or whatever. But there are people from within Univision who have kind of accused producers and directors of forcing people to use Mexican Spanish. I've heard that again and again. So as for the cross-generational aspect, right, by the time you get into the second and third generation, people who are English dominant, right, and Spanish really is their second or secondary language or heritage language. I think that there's, there's a lot of, beyond Miami, I would say there's a good bit of linguistic insecurity sometimes in the second and third generation speakers. In Miami, though, you find I personally observe higher levels of fluidity and proficiency in the typical third-generation Spanish speaker in Miami than I've heard in places like New York or Chicago or Los Angeles, right? And so there is that, but at the same time, there's still a bit of linguistic insecurity because people will sometimes say to them, often family members, que mal hablas el español, right? You speak Spanish horribly. You need to learn Spanish, right? Aplicar no se dice. Se dice solicitar, right? So there's correcting. And that often, that doesn't usually come from society at large. It comes from family members and friends and people that they're close to. So there is that. I mean, we could go on and on about this. And then there's what I highlighted in chapter 4, right, which is among Cubans, there's there's the idea of the later you came or showed up in Miami, the worse you speak Spanish. But then second and third generation Cuban Americans don't always have that sense or that opinion. But curiously, those are the people who are producing more S, more las costas de Cuba rather than la costa de Cuba. So yeah, I don't know if that responds to the question, but just several thoughts. Yes.
Thank you. I recently met a couple. The man is an American and the wife is a Cuban. So he doesn't speak a word. He also doesn't understand, but they have been married for some time. I find that very, very curious. I used to think that if my wife was with a Japanese for 5 minutes, I would learn Japanese. But my question is, do you see a difference between American husbands learning Spanish versus, let's say, an American wife marries a Cuban and she would learn rather easy the language? Is there a difference there? And the ability of either man or woman to learn the language of the opposite?
So I've not looked into that, and my sociolinguistic training forbids me from saying something without a sort of systematic inquiry. What I can tell you is that there's a common thread across studies of Spanish. I can speak to Spanish in the U.S. that women, people who identify as women, cross-generationally tend to have stronger, better abilities in Spanish as bilinguals. And they tend to, of course, there are studies that contradict this, but the general pattern or thread is that women tend to care more about language than men do. In a kind of, and so that's a fair statement in sociolinguistics, right? And the role of the mother in passing down the language. I mean, it's no accident that we have the metaphor of the mother tongue.
But also
The language that
accommodation.
came from the mother.
Things like accommodation and also vulnerability. So yeah.
This is our new sociolinguistic colleague, Jasmine.
I've actually spoken to a lot of people about this when I was living in Mexico, actually. But so learning a second language is very vulnerable. And if you notice, if you're teaching in classrooms, like students won't want to practice because they're especially when they're 15, 16, 17. When they're younger, it's fine, but when they're older, they're like super embarrassed. So a lot of vulnerability is required to pronounce things incorrectly, and oftentimes vulnerability is incompatible with masculinity. And so many times men won't be wanting to be put in that situation of being vulnerable by having accents or speaking improperly. It makes them feel childish.
That's right.
And also women are socialized to accommodate a lot more, meaning that they would likely learn the language of their partner.
Jasmine, I owe you dinner.
I'm so glad you asked that.
Bienvenida a Miami. We're glad to have you here. Yes, sir. I'll pass you the mic.
You're in the you and Philip are both in the educational sector. Philip is a colleague, faculty colleague of mine at FIU. Why do you suppose the educational sector is more refractory to bilingualism than any place else in Miami?
Thank you for that question. Oh God, Philip, are you gonna save me here? I don't know what to say, but like it really, I'm puzzled.
Politics. Politics. And people acting on behalf of the imagined interest of the state. And so look at even symbolic measures like Doral that had floated the idea of passing a bilingual, bicultural ordinance, and an all Venezuelan city council voted it down. Okay, yeah, and so look at who sits on the school board, and so it's the same type of situation. So people acting in the ostensible interest of the state, which is imagined to be English only, and I mean, my colleagues at FIU and I did, in-service workshops for in-service Spanish teachers, and we made some very basic points like, let's not refer to Spanish in Miami as a foreign language, because by the way, it's not, and also the state is named Florida, meaning the presence of Spanish has been here since the very beginning, so forth and so on. And we were yelled down by the teachers for making these very basic sociolinguistic
Many of
points.
whom are Hispanic, by the way.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, in other words, the politics are so inculcated into the system, but also the people who believe they are acting on behalf of the system in the interest of the students and the state and the nation and all the politics that hang on it. So I think for that reason.
Yeah, and all that is like all that lifelines. All that is linked right to the myth that if you raise a kid and educate a kid bilingually, they will end up confused. So we better just give them English, or we have to choose a language in the U.S. that better be English because this is the United States, right? That sort of, yeah.
Hi, I'm a creative,
There you go.
I'm a nonfiction creative writing MFA student, and I was hoping you could speak a bit about the writing process and whether you consider this a bit different than writing strictly for academia or whether it deviated from your previous experience.
You mean writing this book?
Yes.
Oh. Wow. As they say in Spain, you caught me in my underwear. So actually, something that I say in the preface, and it's a very short thing here. And it says that in writing the book, my hope was to capture the highly complex and in some ways paradoxical, contradictory, and enigmatic, not to say illusory, nature of the city's sociolinguistic reality as best I could. This book is not a sociolinguistic study in the traditional fashion, nor is it a sociological treatise, nor a cultural studies monograph. It contains elements of all those things at once to different degrees at different moments. It's principally an account of ideas about Spanish, of representations of the language, and of the ways in which people perceive it. The eclectic register of the book may discomfit some sociolinguists who could possibly regard it as not quote-unquote linguistic enough, while some cultural studies scholars might find it too social scientific for their taste. Sociologists could perhaps consider it too personal, while ethnographers may find its macro-level focus insufficiently intimate. So I guess that was kind of, I'm not a creative writer. I've written a few paragraphs on this rainy day, but nothing I want to see the light of day. There is a comment that Philip made to me last night, actually, is I said, I don't know what I'm going to say tomorrow. And he said, discursify it. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, in the book, you tell stories. And I guess that's what I was doing, because I was sort of inspired by Joan Didion's 1987 Miami, and by Hernán Iglesias y Ya's Miami, La Última Frontera, and I'd also read David Reef's book, was it Going to Miami? Yeah, and those are all these kind of personal, critical, cultural, almost ethnographic, journalistic type things. And I guess after I started writing, I realized how much that was influencing what I was doing. And so every chapter starts with kind of a story, or a vignette, or if you want to call it that. So I feel like there was some creativity behind it and in my thinking, but I had to keep it academic. It was a book for promotion. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure. Let's see, questions way back here. I'm going to run over here, try not to trip over stools.
Andrew, I'm gonna ask a self-serving question, because one of the things that I find interesting in Miami, my own experiences as a Spanish speaker, with a dialect that gets marked as the right dialect.
Yeah, peninsula.
La fe imperial, right? I have noticed variations in the way Cuban speakers speak to me once they determine that I'm a Spanish speaker. So has that come up in any way, shape, or form in your...
Thank you, sir. It has, and that has actually, Philip has actually done some systematic inquiry into that. Can I pass you?
Oh, sure.
Talk about your own study. Yeah.
Oh, right. Well, I'm not even a Spaniard, but I learned Spanish in Spain, so I have that too. And when I moved here 13 years ago, I felt like certain types of people were rolling the red carpet out for me wherever I went. And it often came with like personal family anecdotes, like, "Ay, mi abuela era de Galicia, mi abuela era de," all this stuff. And I thought, why the hell are you telling me, like interesting, but why am I getting these anecdotes? And it happened to me over and over and over again. And then also things like, "Ay, me encantan tus ojos claros." All this. And so then I realized, oh, wait a minute, this is racialized.
Yeah.
So it's like a old world, new world, plus a racialized thing, and plus maybe just harmlessly. A type of fondness for heritage, but I think it's a racialized discourse. And so we launched a study about that where we did perception tests of people's non-conscious biases towards Cuban, Peninsular, and Colombian Spanish, and we found almost exactly what you would expect, namely that when we looked at warmth traits, things like religiosity, friendliness, what else? So-called warmth traits versus competence traits, things like dependability, work ethic, and so forth. Cubans ranked very high on warm traits. Warm, like I like you. You're highly religious. You're friendly. You're okay. But the Spaniards got all the competence traits. Yeah, and so I think it kind of and it was very bifurcated, and Colombians were in the middle. So I think it's racialized.
Yeah, and that was with a technique called match guide perception, where they just hear a voice, and then they have to make a series, agree or disagree with a series of statements that characteristics of that stuff.
But there's also a huge migration from Spain that has happened in recent decade in Miami. So that I wonder how that's going to affect.
Because of the unemployment in Spain.
I wonder, yeah. Keep me on the payroll first.
It's not up to me.
I mean, one thing, I studied in college in Spain, and I go back from time to time, and I just really, I first went there in '91, and it's now 2023, and so every time I go back to Madrid, I'm just like to think of, try to recall, you're from Madrid, what Madrid was in the early '90s. Or late '80s compared to now. There's so much Latin American immigration.
Yeah.
There's so many different varieties of Spanish, and there are so many Anglicisms.
Right.
Everywhere. Signs, this storm windows. That's really, and that's only been 30 years, right? It's really impressive the change. I think that has to do with this thing that I'm loosely calling postmodernity, right? Mass migrations, mass media, global economy, consumerism, etc.
Time for one last question.
I was going to ask, are all these Englishisms acceptable to Spanish speakers?
No.
Because I always hear I teach English as a second language, and I have students come from other parts of the country, and they're like, that's not the right word. The other way around, I hear the English, the Celts, get down from the car, and I'm like, that's not proper English either. So how does all this fit into the sociolinguistic things you guys are talking about, and how acceptable are they in either language? Are they just wrong or not? Or
Well,
are
again,
they
I
getting more
would
acceptable
repeat
nowadays?
that, right? The notion that a form is correct or incorrect is entirely ideological, right? So if you hear a form enough times and are told this is the right form, right, or you're kind of conditioned by this is the voice you always hear on television. So my native dialect sounds something more like this. I grew up in the Hills, North Carolina, so I'm masking that. But if you think about it, what voice do you ever hear on U.S. television that sounds like my native dialect in English? You don't. And so, it's not that people are being told, sounding Southern in English is bad. Sometimes they are, right? But for the most part, people are getting that message implicitly by never hearing those. So there's an erasure, ideological erasure, that goes on. So it's very much ideological. It has to do with politics, economy, the ways of the people who have power, economic power, cultural prestige, etc. speak, right? So the old adage in sociolinguistics is that a language is a dialect with an army. And so this conditions one's ideas about what's correct and what's incorrect. And then that in itself is relative. So in the study that I did with loanwords and calcs, right, I didn't say, do you consider this acceptable or not, right? It was a scale, because you might find some forms not entirely acceptable, but more acceptable than others, right? It's relative in that sense. And then it's relative to the type. And so I said that syntactic calcs, so things like déjame saber, or te llamo para atrás, or cómo te gustó la película, things like that, they went unperceived or more difficultly perceived by most people unless they had really strong abilities in both Spanish and English. Yeah, and so there was one form of all the syntactic calcs, which was te llamo para atrás, which everyone had this sort of strong reaction against, right? Yes, I say it, but it's entirely wrong, right? Just like Southerners, we say ain't, but we know it's wrong, right? So I ain't gonna say it, right? So te llamo para atrás, for me, and I think I do say this in the book, it's almost achieved or attained a kind of iconic sociolinguistic status among the mini calcs. English influenced calcs and Spanish. It's high on the social indexical radar, and people laugh about it and make fun of it, right? Whereas they wouldn't laugh about and make fun of something like déjame saber or cómo te gustó la película, right? Now, those forms could move up the social indexical, right? And I don't know where or how te llamo para atrás started to gain that traction of calling people's attention in the bigger scheme of things. Some people suggest it started in Puerto Rico, and then from there extended with Puerto Rican migration into the US. I'm not blaming Puerto Ricans, where's Yolanda? But my Puerto Rican colleague, Yolanda Martinez, that's what people say, and then from there it sort of spread with the Puerto Rican diaspora in the US. But Yolanda, a lot of people in Puerto Rico say that. Yeah. And these are people who don't really speak much English. But now it's different.
We're proud of whatever.
Well, for whatever reason, it's gone high on the radar and it's stigmatized. And so, you start a conversation with someone, as I often do, and you start asking them about, I'm mostly interested in heritage Spanish, so second and third generation and fourth generation speakers of Spanish in the U.S. And so oftentimes I'll ask, first generation speakers or recent immigrants, what do you think about the Spanish that Miami Latinos speak, right? And in all fairness, some of them are very objective, and they don't say, oh, it's bad Spanish. But the ones who do say, es un español mal hablado, o no saben hablar español, right? I'll say, could you give me an example? And I would say 80% of the time, that example is, dicen cosas como te llamo para atrás. They say things like te llamo para atrás. So it's really hot, but they don't say things like, they say things like, ¿cómo te gustó la película? Or they dicen mucho, déjame saber, right? So it's all relative, right? And it has to do with the fact, I think, that some variants end up being highly socially indexical, while other variants just fall by the wayside, or they're ignored, and they don't acquire that sort of visibility, or as Glissant might say, that kind of transparency. There it is, right, on the radar.
Well, friends, we could be here all night, but it's almost 8 o'clock, which seems good enough.
If you just give me, I do, there are some people here in the audience that I want to acknowledge, and they're in the acknowledgements in the book, starting with Philip Carter, starting with my dear friend and colleague of 25 years now, Elena Grauyaveria. Elena had many conversations with me in her office many years ago about pursuing something that was at the intersection of sociolinguistics and cultural theory and ideology. So I have to credit her for pushing me along down that route. And Lilian Mansour is not here, but she sent me her. She was teaching class this evening. But I have to also acknowledge Leah Mansour, my colleague, who was one of the first Cubans I met in Miami, and who put me in touch literally with half of Cuban Miami when I got down here to do my dissertation research in '98. So, and thank all of you for coming, and special thanks to my colleagues from MLL. Lots of love.
For transcending our visual limitations so brilliantly. Thanks everybody for coming out tonight. It's been a splendid turnout for the first book talk of the academic year. The next one will be on Monday, September 18th at 6:30 when Ashley White, my colleague in the UM History Department, will be speaking about her new book, Revolutionary Things, Material Culture and Politics in the Late 18th Century Atlantic World. So check it out. Andrew, thank you so much again. Philip, thank you again.